Okay, this is our continuation of Chapter 7, looking at the Indian, Asian, and African civilizations. This particular unit is going to focus in on African civilizations. Let's look at the map here. This is the map that we have been looking at the last couple of days. Our focus primarily in history has been European history, focusing initially, of course, on the early Mesopotamian civilizations, early Egyptian civilizations. We looked at the Persians, and as they moved west, their contact with the Greeks, the takeover of the Persian Empire by the Greeks, then the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean world with the Roman Empire, and then we've since talked about the European territories overtaken by the migration of various Germanic tribes in the advance of the Hunnic conquest from the east, the Central Eurasian steppes. And the result, of course, was the collapse of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, leaving the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, to carry on for another 1,000 years. We most recently talked about the collapse of the Byzantine Empire in 1453 at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. In the midst of that, we talked about the beginning of a new group of people, the Islamic civilizations, I should say, the Islamic caliphates in the Saudi Arabian or the Arabian Peninsula. They're starting in Mecca, and its advance through Palestine, Israel, Syria territories, Persian territories, across North Africa into Spain, and eventually, as I said, overtaking the Byzantine Empire in 1453. So that's kind of where we've left our history. We've moved in this chapter eastward and looked at the significant Indian civilizations in the Indus River Valley. We looked briefly at that. We looked briefly in this chapter at the significant civilizations in the Far East in China, its advances, its technologies, its legacies, and of course we looked briefly at Japan as well. And so now we're returning west to the massive continent of Africa. As you can see, Africa is significantly larger than Europe. It is not just one monolithic landmass with a similar or same culture or language or political styles or religion across the entire continent. It is incredibly complex. You can imagine how complex it is. By comparison, we look and see how complex Italy or Europe was, and the various languages, people groups, political and nation building type of styles. There's just such a variety, and well, why would Africa be any different? And so many people think that Africa is just like one big continent. Everybody knows each other, and everybody speaks the same language and thinks the same way and has the same values and priorities. That's a complete misconception. It's incredibly complex and varied and different across this vast continent. So we'll look at some of these civilizations here in just a moment. First, let's look at some geography that you need to be aware of. You can see North Africa is a very thin strip of coastal land on the southern portion of the Red Sea. We've studied some of this area. We've looked at Egypt along the Nile Delta region. We've looked across North Africa to Carthage. We've studied Carthage in relationship to our studies of the Roman Republic in the 4th and 3rd and 2nd centuries. And so we've studied that quite a bit. We've also looked at the spread of Islam across North Africa. But south of that, we've not studied much at all. Now, one of the reasons why is because you can see a vast desert, the Sahara Desert, that basically divides North Africa from the rest of Africa. Everything below the Sahara Desert is called the sub-Sahara Africa. Sub meaning under the desert Africa. So it's all that's underneath the Sahara Desert. And we can see basically some broad divisions of geography. You can see in the middle of Africa, there's the rainforest. The equator basically runs laterally across Africa at this point. So it's basically a rainforest. Think like the Amazon in South America, but you've got a rainforest here right through the middle of Africa. Now, as you move away from both north and south of the equator. I don't want to keep wanting to say equator, the equator. You move into what's called a grassland or a savanna, both north and south of the rainforest. And then as you move further north across the savanna, between that and the desert is basically a transitionary zone. It's a semi-desert region called the Sahel. And I want you to understand that where these lines begin and end basically shift and move as years move forward. So this year, where the Sahel begins and ends, or the desert begins and ends, or the savanna begins and ends, may be different than what it was last year and maybe different than what it will be next year. It's all based on the seasonal rains. And as the rains come or go, or there's a better rainy season or a lesser rain season, this will impact these transition zones or these zones across Africa. And as a result of this is the reason why so much of the African civilization has so often been nomadic, because people have to move where there's water and where there's land or grass for feeding herds and growing crops. So there will be less urban development because of the need to not be stationary, but to be able to move where there's water and arable land. So this is a broad outline of African geography. Note that there is a significant dearth or lack of mountain ranges. Not that there's not mountains, but there's not significant mountain ranges. This is the reason why rain is such a problem, is the lack of mountain ranges. Mountains actually help with rainfall. That's something for a later study. But you can see the Atlas Mountains up there in far northwest Africa. There are some Ethiopian highlands over there off the Horn of Africa and to the west of that. But basically, it's pretty open and relatively flat across much of Africa. Again, please hear me. It's not flat, flat, flat. There are some hills and mountains, but it's not like significant mountain ranges. So this is a little bit of our African geography. Now let's look at a few civilizations. Now, first one we think of is Wakanda Forever. Now, Wakanda may be an invention of Marvel, but let me tell you, there were some significant African civilizations that had significant wealth, significant technology, significant city or urban building. And so although Wakanda may be an invention of the imagination of Stan Lee, or whoever invented Wakanda, that it is not without precedent. There are some significant significant African civilizations. But let's look first to northern African civilizations. Now, there are two that we're already familiar with. One of them you're familiar with because we've studied North Africa and Carthage. We studied this during our study of the Roman Empire, and before that, the Roman Republic. And we talked about the Punic Wars, and we highlighted the Second Punic War with Hannibal. But Carthage was a significant and powerful and wealthy seafaring trading city. These were basically the descendants of Phoenician settlers that had settled along the northern part or the western part of the northern African coastline. And they basically rivaled Rome for much of the 4th and 3rd centuries. And of course, this brought them into great conflict, and Carthage was destroyed in the 3rd century BC after the 3rd Punic War. Or I should say the 2nd century. Now, so Rome will basically dominate North Africa during this time period. After this time period, there is going to be significant building. I want you to look here. This is a picture of the harbor that was built at Carthage. It is a massive harbor enabling significant numbers of ships to come in and to dock, and significant trading. So Carthage was a significant trading port. Eventually, Carthage and North Africa will come under the influence of Islamic Caliphate in the 7th century. There we go. There's another picture of the harbor there. All right. So Yeah, that's the yes, that's the Harper. All right, let's look at another civilization that's part of North Africa that we've already studied. We're going back even further in time. It is a very old and ancient civilization, and we won't spend a lot of time here. We just need to remember that it is indeed African. This is, of course, the Egyptian civilization. Back in the 4th century BC, they were building pyramids, and 3rd century BC, and they were had significant civilization, significant wealth, significant political and military powers. They stretched all the way north into Palestine, Syria territories, coming into conflict and connection with the Mesopotamian world, the Persians. And so, of course, Alexander the Great eventually came through and dominated Egypt. But Egypt has been around for a long while. So we're not going to spend a lot of time here. Just remember, Egypt is a part of Africa. So in North Africa, we've got the Carthaginians and we got the Egyptians. And then south, along the Nile River Valley, we're going to see the development of another kingdom called the Kingdom of Kush. This is basically going to last from about 1000 BC to around 350 AD. Now, what's going to happen is that along the East African coast, there will be significant trading posts that will be established. These will be small, like city-states, but they're going to be quite wealthy. They will trade with the Romans in the during the Roman Republic and Roman Empire time period. Eventually, they will also trade with Persians and with the Arabs. These city-states will trade with interior tribes for animal skin, lumber, ivory, other things as well. But eventually then they will turn and trade these items to others from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. So the Kingdom of Kush was an early North African or Northeast African kingdom that had significant trade partners and was significantly wealthy. The Kingdom of Kush will at one time eventually expand so much and defeat Egypt. And there will actually be a dynasty of Kushite pharaohs, but the Assyrians will drive them out. And so this is a significant and long history. The Kingdom of Aksum will eventually defeat the Kingdom of Kush in 330 AD. Here is a picture of the Nubian queen of the Kingdom of Kush. Her name is Amani-Rina from 440 to 10 BC. Now, as I mentioned before, the Kingdom of Kush will be defeated by the Kingdom of Aksum. The Kingdom of Aksum is going to last for about 9 or 10 centuries, from 80 BC to the 9th century AD. It's located in the northeastern portion of Africa. It's just south of Egypt, and it's basically modern-day Ethiopia. It's going to grow and be prosperous roughly during the same time of the Roman Empire. Lots of gold and ivory is going to be traded with Rome and East. It will embrace Christianity as a result of the work of Frumentus. We'll talk about him in just a minute. The Kingdom of Aksum will be allied with the Byzantine Empire, but eventually will be conquered and taken over by the Islamic caliphates in the 7th and 8th centuries. Now, the medieval Kingdom of Abyssinia in 1270 AD will basically take over this territory. This will become, like I said, in the 13th century, the Kingdom of Abyssinia, a very powerful and influential kingdom during the medieval era. The kings of this territory will claim to be descendants of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba that is mentioned in the biblical text. So this is the Kingdom of Aksum. There's a map where you can see it's located right there on the the coast of the Red Sea. And so it's a very important territory. Here is a picture of the Cathedral of Aksum. This is from a sketchbook dating back to about 1853. And to the right is an Aksunian stela. This is known as the Aksum obelisk. There was a whole bunch of these. You can see one in the background over there, but if you could expand this picture, you'd see there's a bunch of them. These are significant legacies of the Aksumite kingdom. They basically marked graves. They also represent magnificent multi-storied palaces. They're going to be decorated with false doors and windows, which is typical of their design. So this is a pretty cool thing. If you go visit Aksum, or Ethiopia rather, you will see these remnants of Aksum technology and architecture. Now, mentioned that Christianity is going to come to Aksum as a result of a missionary, specifically a Syrian missionary by the name of Frumentus. He actually came to Aksum as a child. He was on a Roman ship that was that docked and came into port there in Aksum, but the Aksumites did not have an affinity for foreigners, and they slaughtered everybody on the ship except for two. One of them was a young boy by the name of Frumentus. He was eventually introduced to the king, who showed favor to this young boy, and made him a part of his court, and became influential. Eventually, this king died, and his young son became the king, but he was too young to be king, and he basically became the ward, or what's the right word? Not controlled, but he was sort of raised by Frumentus, I guess is the best way to say it. And eventually, this young king became a Christian, and this would eventually lead to Aksum adopting Christianity. Frumentus would actually go back to Alexandria, Egypt, and become friends with an associate of Athanasius, and he would eventually become the bishop of Aksum, or the bishop of Ethiopia, in 330 A.D. This is an icon here of the Orthodox Church of Frumentus. So here's the king, actually, King Etzana, from 325 to 360 AD, and it again is under him that Christianity will become the official religion of Aksum. And Aksum is going to be very wealthy. It's going to have a significant trading network. It's going to trade across the Silk Road. You can see there in red that we've talked about already before, but also sort of the water version, the sea version of the Silk Road, trading across the Indian Ocean to India and the Far East. And Aksum will take advantage of these trading networks and build a significant kingdom. So that is sort of the north and northeast part of Africa. What about these central and western portions of Africa? Well, there's a couple of quick tribes we're going to look at. The first one is the Kanum tribe or empire from 700 to 1300 AD. After that is going to be the Bornu Empire, which is from 1380 to 1893 AD. These empires are going to develop along the Niger River Valley. These will be followed by a couple of others just to the west that we'll look at in just a minute. Let's look at the map here. There you can see right in the middle of Africa, the Kanum and Bornu Empire along the Niger River. Now, as you move west, we're going to see the significant empires of the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. These are going to be successive kingdoms built upon the gold trade and the camel trade. Each one of these is going to basically replace the other. The Ghanans will be replaced by the Mali, and the Mali will be replaced by the Songhai. Eventually, Moroccan Muslims will bring an end to the Songhai kingdom. But for a time period between 700 and 1591, these three empires will dominate Western African civilization. Ghana is essentially from 700 to 1200, Mali from 1200 to sometime in the 1400s, and then from 1400s to 1591 will be the Songhai. So let's take a quick look at these. Here is the Ghana Empire, significant urban development. You can see the king illustrated here sitting on his throne, and you can see a camel caravan moving across the land there, but significant building in Central and Western Africa. Now, the one that we're going to talk about more than others is the Mali Empire, and this is going to be a significant Central African empire. The king is Mansa Musa, and he will, some say, be the richest man in all of the world history. This guy is going to be so wealthy that in 1324, he is Muslim. He will make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. And history says that he took over 1,000 people, or part of his entourage. Some sources say over 60,000 people on his entourage. He had with him over 100 camel loads of gold. And as he traveled across with his entourage across North Africa through Alexandria, Egypt, he's going to spend so much money and give so much gold away that he will basically cause inflation, runaway inflation, that is going to take years for their economy to recover from. That's how much gold he spends. And he will build houses there in Egypt. He will build houses in Mecca for him and his servants and his entourage. And he's just spending a ton of money. It is actually him, Mansa Musa, rather, that stories of his gold and his great wealth is going to make its way back to Europe. Because of different traders that will see him and see his gold, and this will make its way back to Europe, and this will intrigue European nations, and they will want to know more about this land of great gold. Unfortunately, this will end in the colonization of Africa as people are looking for gold and this vast resources. So this is the Mali Empire, Mansa Musa, who was probably the wealthiest man in the world. Now, this was followed by the Songhai Empire, very successful militaristic empire. Sunni Ali the Great is going to be the king from 1464 until 1492. He is probably the most significant of the leaders, of the kings of the Songhai Empire. Now, the last one we're going to look at in this territory is actually what we call the forest kingdoms, and it's the kingdom of Benin. You can see it right in the middle of there. It's in blue, the middle of that map there. But this is going to be a significant empire, or kingdom, I should say. That's a better term. Kingdom from 1440 to 1897 for about 400 years. And this is modern-day Nigeria. But it's going to trade along the coast with various city-states, become very wealthy, known for metalworking and bronze statues. Here's a picture of a king having court with some Portuguese explorers. Now, as we look at the African economy across the continent, you're going to find that it's quite varied. There's obviously going to be pastoralists, those that raise cows and goats and sheep, and that's how they make their living through a nomadic lifestyle. There are those that will have a more sedentary lifestyle, stationary, because they will plant crops and grow them and domesticate animals. So that will happen in different portions of the continent. Hunting, of course, will be significant, especially on the savannah. You can see one of the famous Maasai tribal persons hunting a lion there in that right, but they are known for their expertise in hunting. African trade will be a significant portion of their economy. Trading not just across Central or interior Africa, but trading to coastal territories, coastal kingdoms, who will then trade even further outside of the continent of Africa, trading to Arabian traders, trading to Persians, Europeans, Indians, and as far as China in the Far East. So the African trade network will be quite vast, and they will trade a lot of different things. Animals were used, for instance, in Rome, the Roman Empire, but certainly not just Rome. It was used in the Middle East. They were used in Europe for entertainment. People wanted to see exotic animals, see them fighting, men fighting them, or them fighting one another. Here's a picture of entertainment of Roman soldiers fighting some elephants. And of course, they were used in executions as well. Romans used them for executing Christians and other prisoners of the state. Animal skins were significant trading commodities as well. Lion furs, leather from zebras and antelopes, crocodile skins. These were all very treasured across the globe. Ivory, the tusks from elephants, were a significant trading commodity, so much so that elephants became endangered because people would hunt them, kill them simply for cutting off their horns. Rhinoceros, I should say those were tusks. Horns are rhinoceros. Rhinoceros horns were significant trading commodities as well. They were used for various things. Some Far Eastern People groups would grind the powder, the horns up into powder and use them for medicinal purposes or for virility. They could also be carved with different images. You can see one on the right. Again, rhinoceroses were on the endangered or are on the endangered species list because of this. Gold was a significant commodity that was found in Africa and traded. Silver was also significant for trading. Salt was incredibly important. Salt is not just a fun thing that you like to put on your food. It's actually incredibly important. Our bodies need salt. It's not just for flavoring food. And salt became incredibly important to trade. Matter of fact, the Romans used salt as a way to pay their soldiers. The word salary comes from the Latin word for salt. And here you can see a salt caravan trading big slabs of salt. Another very significant trading commodity, unfortunately, was people. The slave trade is and has been for a long time a very large component of the economy of Africa. Here you have pictured Swahili Arab slave traders along with their captives along the Rovuma River in Mozambique in the 19th century. This is important to know. United States and Western countries became known for the transatlantic slave trade in the 16, 17, and 1800s. It's important to know that the African slave trade that became dominant after the 1500s was not just dominated or just not a part of Western economy, but even the Eastern economy. Scholars actually estimate that over 4 million Africans were transported from sub-Saharan Africa to the Islamic Middle East before the transatlantic slave trade began in the 1500s. So over 4 million Africans were already being taken from Africa, just the sub-Sahara, to the Middle East. And that continued after the slave trade in the West began. The Middle East slave trade will last basically from the 7th century to the 20th century, so for about 1,300 years. From East Africa alone, 8 million slaves will be taken east via the Trans-Saharan route, and then another 9 million would be taken from East Africa via the Red Sea and Indian Ocean ports. That's 17 million East Africans alone that were taken to the East, to the Middle East and India, etc. Now, by comparison, about 10 million Africans will come to North America. Most of those will end up in the Caribbean and in South America. About 388,000 were brought to the United States, and there's an estimate of another 60 to 70,000 that will come from the Caribbean to the U.S. But I want you to think about, what happened in the United States. It was a horrible, terrible, terrible thing. It is a blemish on our history that our economy was based on the subservience of other people, demeaning and humiliating and thinking other people, specifically people of African descent, were less than human. And that's a horrible, horrible, terrible thing. It is a sin. This is a mark of the brokenness of humanity that we've talked about. Sin has broken humanity, and we often bring war and violence and injustice to other people, often in the name of making ourselves more wealthy or developing ourselves, or sometimes just because we think we're better than them, and sometimes, unfortunately, in the name of God. And there were many people who used Christianity, even tried to use the Bible by taking it out of context, to justify the African slave trade. So it was a horrific thing, and it's unfortunately has had long-term ramifications for our country. But I do want you to know, I want to remind you that slavery has been a worldwide problem across the course of human history. And it has happened in every civilization. When people go to war against other people, they often take slaves and make them their servants. And this is unfortunately something that continued. Now, I know some people will say, well, the United States and Europe were different because it wasn't about war. It was just about taking people. I agree. but the result is the same thing. I don't care what the motivation is. The result is the same thing. People were taken away from their families. They were treated less than human. And this has happened across human history. And unfortunately, it was a part of American history. But it did happen. But I do want it to put it into perspective. The United States was not only not the only country that participated in this, not the only civilization, but in far fewer numbers. Less than 500,000 people were brought to the United States. Less than 500,000. And by comparison, when you look at what happened across, South America, was they say 10 million slaves were brought. Most of those went to South America. Unfortunately, 9.5 million went to South America and 500,000 went here. Unfortunately, the United States sort of bears the brunt of the slavery black eye and the dark part of history. I just want to give perspective. It wasn't just the United States. Please hear me. I'm not justifying. It's a horrible thing, but I do want to put it in perspective. And again, by comparison, over 17 million from East Africa alone went to Muslim Eastern countries across the Middle East and India. So there's a lot of blame to go around. There's a lot of mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, our fault, our blame that should go around. It shouldn't rest solely on in European or American shoulders. We should all bear the brunt of that. Here's a few pictures. These are Nubian slaves waiting to be sold at a slave market in ancient Egypt. Here's another picture of black Zans captured in a slave trade being marched to a slave market in the Arabian world. This is a slave market in Khartoum in the Sudan in 1876. And then, of course, here's a picture of slaves in the southern United States who were forced to pick cotton in the 19th century. And here's a picture of the horrible conditions of a slave ship, a transatlantic slave ship, as these individuals are unfortunately brought to the United States. And then famously, here's a picture of Tipu Tip, who was a Zanzibarian slave trader who he himself owned 10,000 slaves. This is from the late 19th century. So I want you to know that there's a lot of slave trade that happened across history. Africa has bore the brunt of it in many ways over the last millennium. It is an unfortunate and horrible thing that has happened in human history. Now, lastly here, let's look quickly at African religions. Traditional African religion is basically quite varied and complex, but generally can be characterized as animalistic, poly, and/or pantheistic, depending on the area and the specific tribes. They will often venerate the dead. They will use magic and medicine as a part of their worship. Islam is a significant religion, especially in North Africa. We'll look at a map here in just a minute, but Islam is a religion that basically came into the African continent via the conquests of the Islamic caliphates in the 7th and 8th centuries. And then finally, Christianity. Christianity is a significant religion in the sub-Saharan part of Africa. It came to Africa via Christian missionaries through Egypt, across North Africa, eventually into Aksum, south of Egypt, and it will spread significantly during European colonization in the 18th and 19th centuries as the missionary movements in Europe and the United States became a thriving movement as people desired to spread Christianity throughout the world, in Africa, in India, and in China, and all places, taking seriously the Christian mandate that Jesus put before us to go throughout the world and spread the good news, making disciples of all who might desire to come to faith in Jesus Christ. So Christianity has spread across Africa as well, and it's a thriving religion. Here is a map showing you the major religions and how it has shifted over the decades. Currently, today, much of southern Africa is Christian. Much of northern Africa is Islamic. And of course, you can see those regions in the red that hold to traditional African religions. Now, lastly, colonization in Africa. We're going to talk more about after the Christmas break, but colonization in Africa by European powers, where they essentially divide Africa up. Let's not talk to the Africans about this. Let's just do it. This happened in the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, and they will divide it up across the major European powers. This is a specific map that shows what Africa looked like in 1914, just before World War I broke out. So at this point, 90% of the continent, 90% of Africa is controlled by European powers. This is unfortunate. You can see the major countries. The yellow is the United Kingdom. The green there is France. Those are by far the largest portions of territory owned by two major European powers. But Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Belgium will all have large chunks of Africa under their control. So this is our study, our very quick summary of Africa. We'll talk more about this in class.